London, July 1st, 2025. A team of geneticists at the Francis Crick Institute opens the results of a genome sequence that took 4 decades of failed attempts to make possible. The sample, a single human tooth. The source, a man buried 4,800 years ago in a rock-cut tomb near a place called Beni Hasan in Egypt. The tooth had been sitting in a museum drawer since early 20th century excavations. Nobody had thought much about it. Until now. The results came back clean. Contamination under 2%. Coverage good enough to read. And what they read stopped the room. The ancestry breakdown showed approximately 77% North African Neolithic ancestry. That part made sense. That part was expected. But then, the second number. Over 22% Eastern Fertile Crescent ancestry, most closely matched to Neolithic populations from Mesopotamia. From the world of the Sumerians. In the oldest complete Egyptian genome ever sequenced, from a man buried while the pyramids were being built, more than 1/5 of his DNA came from the civilization that invented writing 1,500 miles to the east. Stay with me, because this next part is the reason this video exists. Here's the thing. Scientists had been trying to sequence ancient Egyptian DNA since the 1980s. Nobel Prize winner Svante Pääbo made the first attempt in 1985. He pulled tissue from a mummy at the Berlin Museum and got nothing usable back. He published the failure anyway to document the problem for whoever came next. The heat of the Nile Valley destroys DNA so fast that pharaonic Egypt had been a complete genetic black box for 150 years of archaeology. Not because nobody tried, because the climate made it nearly impossible. What changed wasn't the science. What changed was a ceramic pot. The man in this study wasn't mummified. He wasn't a pharaoh. He received no elaborate burial. He was placed inside a ceramic vessel, inside a stone-cut tomb at elevated ground above the floodplain. That specific combination, fired clay, stone, height, slowed the DNA degradation just enough. For 4,800 years, his tooth waited in a drawer. And what it carried inside it rewrote everything. Dr. Pontus Skoglund and his team at the Francis Crick Institute confirmed it. This was not a statistical artifact, not a contamination error. This was a genetic signal robust enough to survive 48 centuries, the scrutiny of the world's largest ancient genome reference database, and every contamination test available to modern science. Everything I just told you, hold on to it. Because it's about to mean something completely different. This man was not an immigrant. Isotope analysis confirmed he grew up in the Nile Valley, ate local food, drank local water, lived and died as an Egyptian by every geographic measure available. The Mesopotamian ancestry wasn't his. It belonged to his ancestors. It was already in the Egyptian population, woven in so deep that by 2800 BCE, it was simply part of what it meant to be Egyptian. And here's the thing that doesn't let go. The Sumerians and Egyptians were building their greatest monuments at almost the exact same time. Same century, 2 civilizations, 1,500 miles apart. And one was already living inside the other's genome before any recorded historical contact between them. The chronology everyone was working with just collapsed. Before we go further, real quick, I want to know something about you. Drop in the comments, where does your family trace back to? Even just a country or region is enough. Because what this genome data reveals next connects to more of the world's population than most people realize. And I want to see how many of you are already part of this story without knowing it. That chronology, the one that placed Sumer and Egypt as 2 separate peaks of human genius rising independently in their own river valleys, rested on one assumption: that the people who built these civilizations had no deep biological connection. One genome just removed that assumption. But to understand why it matters this much, you need to understand what the Sumerians actually were. And the answer is stranger than anything they wrote about themselves. The Sumerian language has no known relatives, not one. Every major ancient language, Akkadian, Egyptian, the ancestor of Arabic, the ancestor of Persian, the ancestor of every European language, belongs to a family. You can trace them. You can see how they connect. Sumerian cannot be connected to anything. Linguists have spent 150 years searching. The language stands completely alone in the human record. But here's where it gets strange. Dr. Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard Medical School, working alongside Dr. Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna, spent years piecing together the first ancient DNA data from pre-pottery Neolithic Mesopotamia, from sites in southeastern Turkey and northern Iraq. When they published in Science in 2022, what they found was the opposite of isolation. Genetically, Neolithic Mesopotamia was a convergence zone, a meeting point for populations coming from the west, the east, the north, the south, all mixing, all overlapping, all forming something new over thousands of years. So here's the picture: a language with no relatives, a genetic population formed from all directions, the same civilization. And what that tells us is, the Sumerians were not a mystery people from somewhere unknown. They were the product of Mesopotamia itself, a slow crystallization of populations that had been forming for 4,000 years before the first city. The mystery was never where they came from. The mystery is where they went, and the data now has an answer to that. But before we get there, one more thing about the Sumerians that most people don't know. The Akkadians, who conquered Sumer politically in 2334 BCE under a ruler named Sargon, are documented in the same genetic dataset as carrying the same West Asian Neolithic ancestry foundation as the Sumerian period populations before them. The conquerors and the conquered. The same genome. The most famous civilizational transition in ancient Mesopotamian history, the one historians call the fall of Sumer, was not a replacement. It was a renaming. The genome didn't change, the name on the jar did. That jar, and what it was made of, is the reason this episode exists. Heat is not a metaphor in this story, it is the antagonist. The Nile Valley's average temperature degrades DNA molecules at a rate that destroys a complete genome within centuries. Not millennia, centuries. Which means that for 150 years of archaeology, through every tomb opening, every mummy unwrapping, every museum inventory of ancient Egyptian remains, the genetic record of pharaonic civilization was invisible, not hidden, gone. This discovery had been sitting in a museum drawer for over a century. Nobody talked about what was inside it, until now. Dr. Pontus Skoglund's 2025 study explains why this one survived. The individual was buried in a ceramic vessel, fired clay, inside a rock-cut tomb at elevated ground above the Nile floodplain. That specific combination created a microenvironment just cold and dry enough to slow the damage. Not stop it, slow it, by 4,800 years. The difference between readable and unreadable DNA in ancient Egypt came down to how one ordinary man happened to be buried. And here's the thing that should make you stop. This man received no special burial, no mummification, no gold mask, no inscribed tomb walls with his name and titles. The mummification process, the most elaborate preservation technology in the ancient world, applied to every person of importance in Egyptian civilization, destroyed the molecular record of every individual it touched. The heat treatment, the natron salt, the oils, all of it degraded DNA irreversibly. Every pharaoh who ever lived, every high priest, every court official, genetically invisible. The only complete genome from ancient pharaonic Egypt belongs to someone who left no text, no title, no name. This isn't just ancient history. The question of what gets preserved and what gets erased, that question is still active, and it connects directly to where you come from right now. Svante Pääbo published his 1985 failed attempt in the scientific literature, knowing the result was negative because he wanted whoever came next to know where the wall was. 40 years later, the next generation didn't break the wall. They found a door nobody had tried, in a ceramic pot, in a museum drawer, with a tooth no one had thought to sequence. And what was inside that tooth was a living ghost. The Eastern Fertile Crescent ancestry in the Old Kingdom Egyptian genome, the same Mesopotamian Neolithic profile documented in the Lazaridis 2022 dataset, doesn't end in the ancient record. A 2011 Y chromosome survey of modern Iraqi populations found haplogroup patterns in southern Iraq consistent with deep genetic continuity from the Neolithic. The genetic heirs of the population whose ancestry appears in pharaonic Egypt are alive today. They live in the marshlands of southern Iraq, and they have not been told. They were never told. The Madaan, the Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, have been living in the Mesopotamian delta, where the Tigris and Euphrates come together before reaching the Persian Gulf, since before any written record begins. Their settlements are built on floating islands of bundled reeds. Their fishing techniques appear in Sumerian stone reliefs carved 5,000 years ago. Their architecture, the Mudhif, a vaulted hall made entirely from reeds, shows up at Al-Ubaid, a pre-Sumerian settlement dated to 5000 BCE. They did not borrow this tradition from anyone. They are the tradition's continuous, unbroken source. What they found next changed everything we thought we knew about genetic survival in conflict zones. A 2011 scientific survey of Y chromosome markers in the modern Madaan documented haplogroup patterns consistent with deep time continuity from Neolithic Mesopotamia. Haplogroup J, associated with the Zagros Mountains and the northern Mesopotamian Neolithic expansion, present at frequencies that point to ancient, in-place population persistence. These people did not arrive recently. They did not migrate in from somewhere else. The data says they have been there, genetically, for thousands of years, carrying in their Y chromosomes the biological inheritance of the civilization that gave humanity its first cities. Between 1991 and 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime drained 90% of the Mesopotamian marshes, diverted the Euphrates and Tigris tributaries, destroyed the ecosystem, forced the displacement of 250,000 people. The United Nations called it one of the largest environmental disasters in modern history. The Madaan population fell to under 20,000 within a decade. After 2003, the water was restored. The Madaan came back, and what their chromosomes carried had never left. Think about what that means. The most recent attempt to erase the genetic and cultural descendants of Mesopotamia's founding population didn't happen 3,000 years ago. It happened in 1991. Bulldozers and irrigation schemes applied to the people whose ancestors built the world's first cities on the same ground. And the genome survived, the same way it survived the Akkadians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, every empire that moved through that land, by continuing in bodies when the record stopped. Actually, real quick, if you watched my last video on ancient population movements, you already saw the first piece of this puzzle. This same pattern, a founding genetic population surviving through political collapse, invasion, and erasure, keeps appearing in the record everywhere we look. Did that change how you think about who actually continues civilizations? Tell me in the comments. Then stay with me, because what's coming in the next 2 segments is what that video was building toward. There are 3 things the genetic record reveals about the Marsh Arabs. The third one rewrites the story. An Iraqi-American engineer named Azam al-Wash returned to the marshes after 2003 to lead the restoration effort. In a TED Talk, he described the Madaan's relationship to their land as something that runs in their blood. He meant it as a metaphor. The Y chromosome data suggests he was describing a genetic reality more precisely than he knew. And still, no one has told them what their genome remembers. The second Mesopotamian genetic migration pulse documented in the Lazaridis 2022 data, the one that eventually helped seed both early European farming populations and the Old Kingdom Egyptian genome, has no name in any archaeological or historical record. We know it happened because 7,000-year-old Anatolian farmers carry its signal. We know it came from Mesopotamia. We don't know what these people called themselves. We don't know their language. We don't know why they moved. A migration that helped build the genetic foundation of 3 different civilizations left behind no name. Only the chemistry of a genome, 9,000 years later. The unnamed population left only one record, their descendants. And what those descendants carry, worked out through the Lazaridis 2022 data and cross-referenced against the 2025 Egyptian genome, shows something that no single migration story can explain. The path from Mesopotamia to Egypt was not one migration, it was a relay. A 4,000-year chain of people who each moved a short distance, handed their genome forward, and never knew where it was going. The first pass happened at Chayanu in southeastern Turkey around 7200 BCE. Before the first Sumerian city, before the first wheel, before writing. A community of roughly 1,500 people farming, raising animals, carrying a specific Eastern Fertile Crescent ancestry profile, not knowing that their descendants' 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 descendants would eventually be building pyramids along the Nile. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the conventional model predicted. Dr. Lazaridis at Harvard and Dr. Songül Alpaslan-Roodenberg at the University of Vienna confirmed it in their 2022 science paper. The ancient Mesopotamian Neolithic wasn't a source point, it was a mixing chamber. Populations arrived from multiple directions, converged, recombined, and then left in new configurations. What came out of Neolithic Mesopotamia was already a hybrid, already carrying the accumulated genetic histories of people from the Zagros, from the Levant, from the Caucasus foothills. When the Sumerians eventually crystallized from this population and built their cities, they were expressing a culture grown from that mixture. And the mixture kept moving. A separate 2022 study published in Science Advances described Upper Mesopotamia during the Neolithic as a migration hub. Not a settled origin point, a hub. A place where people arrived and then left in different combinations. This is not a minor detail. It changes the entire grammar of how we talk about civilizational origins. The question is not which civilization was first, it's who was transmitting, who received, and who wrote the receipt. The academic consensus, the one held for over a century, positioned Egypt as a parallel development to Mesopotamia. Two rivers, two civilizations, two stories of human genius arising independently, connected by trade, connected by cultural exchange, but genetically separate. The 2025 Nature Genome Study doesn't complicate that consensus, it inverts it. The connection wasn't cultural diffusion, it was peopling. The actual biological movement of ancestral bodies across the landscape, generation after generation, relay baton after relay baton, for 4,000 years. And what arrived in Egypt wasn't an idea borrowed from Mesopotamia, it was Mesopotamian ancestry, carried in the body of a man buried in a ceramic pot, embedded so deep in the Egyptian population that by the time the Great Pyramid was being built, it had been there for centuries. Not a visitor, not an import, part of what Egypt was, a structural collapse of the most foundational assumption in the history of civilization studies. Independent. That word has done an enormous amount of work in the history of how we tell the story of civilization. And here's what the evidence, assembled cleanly, seems to say about it. The Sumerians formed from the Mesopotamian Neolithic over thousands of years. The Akkadians who conquered them politically shared the same genetic base, confirmed by Lazaridis et al. The Mesopotamian genetic signal then moved through the Neolithic relay and arrived in Egypt by 2855 BCE, embedded at over 22% in the oldest complete Egyptian genome ever sequenced. This is a coherent story. It has a shape. It has an answer. The evidence is in, and the answer is here. Everything I just told you, hold on to it, because it's about to mean something completely different. The Sumerian king list, a cuneiform document recording the kings of Sumer, recovered from multiple copies spanning the 3rd millennium BCE, continues through the Akkadian period without a break. Same scribal format, same mythological framing. The line between Sumerian and Akkadian entries has no narrative rupture. No, and then came the outsiders. No awareness of replacement. The people writing the records were the same genetic population, calling themselves by a different political name. At the level of daily life, the transition may not have felt like a collapse at all. The music can settle. The story has its shape. The viewer can exhale. And then, one finding from the Lazaridis 2022 dataset that received almost no coverage outside specialist literature. The populations associated with the post-Akkadian period in Mesopotamia carry, in the ancestry modeling, higher concentrations of the Eastern Fertile Crescent Neolithic component than the populations associated with the preceding Sumerian cultural period. Read that again. The conquerors carried more of the Sumerian genetic signature than the Sumerians themselves. The replacement of Sumer by Akkad was not a genetic replacement in either direction. At the molecular level, it was the Sumerians expanding their own genetic frequency under a different name. The last known text written in the Sumerian language rather than Akkadian is a temple hymn from Nippur. Dated to approximately 1750 BCE, nearly 600 years after the political fall of Sumer. The language survived in religious and scholarly use long after it died in daily speech. The genome that underlies the people who wrote it was still there. in higher concentration than ever, carrying forward everything the political collapse was supposed to have erased. Which means civilizational fall is not a genetic event. The fall of Sumer was a change in administrative language and political identity. The genome continued, and the genetic fault line, the gradual movement of the Mesopotamian Neolithic signal westward across the 3rd millennium BCE, correlates with documented population movements out of southern Mesopotamia, moving west, moving southwest, through the Levant, through the Sinai, into the Nile Valley. The war that separated Sumer from Egypt was not a war. It was a 2,000-year genomic migration that arrived silently inside the founding population of the world's most famous civilization. And the civilization that received it never said so. Why didn't they say so? Let's sit with that question for a moment. Giza, approximately 2560 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is under construction. The largest coordinated workforce in the ancient world, estimated at 20,000 workers, is moving 2.3 million limestone blocks across a plateau that will be called one of humanity's greatest achievements for the next 4,500 years. And somewhere among the people building it, somewhere in the general population of Egypt in that century, is a man with over 22% Mesopotamian Fertile Crescent ancestry in his genome. His children carry it. Their children carry it. It runs through the population like a river that forgot it came from somewhere. The Mesopotamian ancestry in that old kingdom genome wasn't brought in by a traveler. It wasn't deposited by a foreign merchant or a diplomatic marriage. It was already in the Egyptian population so deeply for so long that it was indistinguishable from what it meant to be Egyptian. By the time the pyramids went up, this ancestry had been Egyptian for centuries. Dr. Pontus Skoglund's team at the Francis Crick Institute confirmed this through comparative analysis against over 4,000 modern and 977 ancient reference genomes. The Eastern Fertile Crescent component, over 22% of the Old Kingdom individual's genome, matched most closely to Neolithic Mesopotamian groups. The same genetic world that Lazaridis had documented as the foundation of Sumerian cultural populations. This is not a statistical shadow. This is a confirmed, peer-reviewed signal that survived every test available to 2025 science. So here is the thing that cannot be unfelt. Egyptian civilization was not invented in isolation. The pyramids, the hieroglyphs, the cosmology, the concept of divine kingship, they were built by a population that carried, in their cells, the genetic inheritance of the civilization that had already done it once. Not consciously, not as a continuation, but biologically. The Mesopotamians who built who wrote the first law codes, who recorded the first flood narrative, who invented the accounting system that all later accounting descended from, they are in the genome of the people who built the Sphinx. And Egyptian mythology placed the origin of civilization in Egypt, divinely ordained, arising from the Nile, complete in itself. The Sumerian contribution, the genetic inheritance flowing through the population, does not appear in a single Egyptian text, not as acknowledgement, not as memory, not as history. Now, is that a choice? Was it a deliberate erasure? The genome cannot tell us intent. It can only tell us scale, and the scale is this. One of the most elaborate and durable origin mythologies in human history was constructed by a population that carried, at the molecular level, the genetic heritage of the civilization whose existence that mythology implicitly denied. This isn't just about ancient Egypt. If you've ever taken a DNA test, or if you've ever thought about one, there's a real chance the Eastern Fertile Crescent genetic signal we're talking about runs through your ancestry too. It spread into Anatolia, into Europe through early farmers, into North Africa. Millions of people alive today carry a portion of this same genetic inheritance, not as an abstraction, as a measurable percentage. In your cells right now, there may be a trace of the relay, a fragment of the signal that went from the marshlands of southern Iraq to the tomb at Beni Hasan. You may have been part of this story before you started watching it. There's something I need to tell you about this story, something the study itself makes clear and that most videos on this topic will skip over because it's uncomfortable. The entire case we've been building rests on one genome, one individual from one burial site in one region of Egypt. That's not a weakness I'm about to hand-wave away. That is the most important fact in the episode, because here's what it means. Every pharaoh who ever ruled Egypt, genetically invisible. Every priest who performed the rites, every scribe who wrote the records, every craftsman who carved the stones, their DNA is gone, destroyed by the climate, by the mummification process, by the very preservation methods their civilization was most proud of. We have one complete ancient Egyptian genome, one data point from the entire span of pharaonic history, and that single data point carries over 22% Mesopotamian Neolithic ancestry. Think about what that absence tells us. For 150 years, archaeologists excavated thousands of Egyptian sites, cataloged hundreds of thousands of objects, and studied millions of pages of text. The genetic record, the one layer of evidence that cannot be curated, cannot be edited, cannot be rewritten after the fact, was simply unavailable. Everything we concluded about ancient Egyptian origins during those 150 years was built without the most fundamental kind of biological evidence. Not because researchers were careless, because the climate made it impossible. The gap in this record is not a footnote. The gap in this record is itself a piece of evidence. It tells us that the most powerful civilizations leave the most curated archives, and curated archives can tell the story their creators chose to tell. The ceramic pot tells a different story, not the story of power, the story of what continued when power ended. One genome does not prove a population-wide pattern. Researchers working on this will say so clearly, and they're right. What this single genome does is establish a proof of concept and open a question that cannot be closed. It proves that Mesopotamian Neolithic ancestry was present in at least one individual from Old Kingdom Egypt at over 22%. It proves that recovering whole genomes from this period is now possible. And it points to every ceramic pot burial, every rock-cut tomb at elevation, every non-elite burial site in Egypt as a potential source of evidence that has not yet been tested. The next study may confirm this pattern across dozens of individuals, or it may find that this man was an outlier, a descendant of a small, isolated community that carried unusual ancestry. We don't know yet. That research is being done right now, which means you are watching this story before it ends. The genome is being read, the answer is being built, and the absence, this 4,800-year gap between the burial and the sequencing, that absence is the loudest thing in the episode, because it tells you that the most important evidence about the ancient world is not in the museums. It's in the ground, in teeth, in ceramic pots, in the places nobody thought to look for the last 150 years. If you've ever wondered where you really come from, and I mean really, not the name on a family tree, not a story passed down, but the actual biological record of the people who made you possible, then subscribe. Because what this channel is building toward goes deeper than any one video. This is only the beginning of what the genome record is about to tell us. The Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq are still in the marshes. The water came back. The Reed Islands are being rebuilt. The Mudhif halls are standing again. And in those communities, in people going about their daily lives right now, the Y chromosomes carry haplogroup patterns pointing back to the Neolithic, to the same genetic world that fed into Sumerian civilization, to the same population whose ancestry eventually appeared in Old Kingdom Egypt. Biological memory running unbroken through 9,000 years of empire, invasion, drainage schemes, and restoration. They don't know what the genome remembers. Nobody has sat down with a Madan and said, the DNA science places your ancestry at the origin point of urban civilization. Nobody has connected the genetic dots between the Reed Islands of southern Iraq and the Pyramid Age of Egypt. The science has been published in journals read by a few thousand specialists. The people it's about are not in those journals. Somewhere in the ground beneath Cairo, beneath Alexandria, beneath the Delta region, beneath every site where non-elite Egyptians were buried in the 3rd millennium BCE, there are teeth in ceramic pots. Most of them will be too degraded to sequence, but some of them won't be. And every one that survives is another data point in the argument we have been building for 4 years. Another vote on the question of whether this Mesopotamian signal was widespread or incidental. Another voice from people who left no text. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. They wrote hymns to their cities. They recorded their kings going back in their own mythology to before the flood. They believed, or at least they wrote, that kingship descended from the sky. And somewhere in that cosmology, in that specific idea that civilization was a gift from above, not a development from below, there is a people who had no memory of where they came from. Because the relay was too long, the chain of transmission too many generations deep. By the time the Sumerians were writing, the migrants who started the relay at Chayunu were 9,000 years gone. By the time Egyptians were building pyramids, even the Sumerians were generations away from anything the Egyptian population could have called our ancestors from the East. The genome remembers what the people forgot. That's the whole argument. The biology held the record when the culture lost it. And the record says there was one civilization, not two. One slow biological transmission, carrying the accumulated knowledge of how to build, how to organize, how to write, how to govern, moving across the ancient world in human bodies, leaving the same genetic signature in Mesopotamian temples and Egyptian pyramid complexes, called by different names, worshipping different gods, writing in different scripts, carrying the same inheritance. History drew a line between Sumer and Egypt and called it separation. The genome drew no such line. The man in the ceramic pot at Beni Hasan died without a name in the record. He left no inscription, no monument, no text that anyone has found. But in his tooth, in the enamel and cementum that held his DNA intact for nearly 5,000 years, he left the most important document in the history of ancient civilization studies. He left the truth that the monuments were too grand to say out loud.